Hello, I'm Dr. Pamela Owen, paleontologist and Associate Director of Texas Memorial Museum. I am here in the Hall of Geology and Paleontology, going to share with you secrets in skeletons. Fossils, bones, and teeth, they all provide us clues about an animal's lifestyle. We can learn about how animals move, what they ate, how they experience their world through their senses, just by looking at skeletons. I'm standing in front of the Permian and Triassic cases here in the Hall of Geology and Paleontology. And the skeletons in this case are great examples of tetrapods, animals that have 4 limbs. So when we think about ourselves as tetrapods, 2 arms and 2 legs. And there's a very ancient pattern that we see in tetrapods, and it's sort of the magic number 5. And it's looking at the basic body plan of having 5 fingers and 5 toes. And if you look at the skeletons, we've got giant amphibians, we've got Dimetrodon, which is an ancestor to our mammalian family tree. We see 5 fingers and 5 toes. That's something that unites us all as members of this group. That means we're all related. So when we look at the fossil record of amphibians and reptiles and look at the skeletons of amphibians and reptiles living today, you might notice that, the legs are spread out to the side and the elbows and the knees, if you will, are at 90-degree angles. We call this a sprawling stance. And this is a great advantage for animals because this is hard to be knocked over when you have this really strong supported position of your limbs. When we look at dinosaurs, including birds, and also look at mammals, both these vertebrate groups evolved a pattern of holding their limbs underneath their body. And there's an advantage to this. So you can run faster, you're a little more agile. The drawback is you could fall down a little bit easier, right? We've all taken a spill. But the advantages outweigh those chances of falling down. As a scientist, as a paleontologist, I am really interested in mammals. And one thing mammals are really good at is running. And we see a whole slew of adaptations, all focused on walking and running. And we can see this in the skeletons. What I have here, we've got the forelimbs, so we've got the shoulder blade, the scapula, all the way down to the toe claws, from the forelimb of a cat, the same thing here for a dog. And then I've got what we would consider the hand, if you will, the wrist bones down of a sheep, a pig, and a cow. And I've also got part of the bones of a horse. These are all mammals. They all are related, but you'll notice the patterns are a little bit different. We can see that the cats and dogs have more toes. When we look at the pigs, we see 4 toes. 2 toes are really carrying all the weight with these 2 side toes. We've got the sheep and the cow at that same pattern where 2 toes are holding most of the weight. And then with horses, it's a single toe. So these are all fabulous adaptations for running or climbing or walking. So lots of changes take place in the forelimbs when we look at mammals. One also pattern we see is how they hold their hands and feet. And so when we think about how we can stand on our tiptoes, or in this case, the balls of my feet, I am not a ballet dancer, so I can't do anything with toe shoes. So all you ballet dancers out there, you know what I'm talking about, if you can actually toe dance. Mammals have been able to accomplish sort of the same things. So when we look at a cat or a dog, check out your pets at home with all those paw pads. They're walking around on the balls of their feet. So you can stand up and try that for yourself. So if you're on the balls of your feet and walking around, you are just like a cat or a dog. And there's an advantage to that. Because if you compare it to how we walk with our heel down on the floor, bears do this, raccoons do this, opossums do this, flat-footed, there's a big difference if we need to get away really quickly. And you can try this experiment yourself. So pretend you're ready to start a race, and you're going to start, but your heels are solidly on touching the ground. And try to strike off like you're going to run, win that race. Now compare that if you were going to start the race on the balls of your feet. So you're more in a position like this, you'll notice that you can take off so much faster than you would when you were flat-footed. And there's a reason why we have starting blocks for runners in track and field. And that basically puts your feet in a position similar to what you see in a cat or a dog. Now the ballet dancers of our world include horses, literally tiptoeing on their middle toes and middle fingers. Or if we look at cattle, sheep, and goats, walking on two. So instead of being on the balls of their feet, they are literally walking on that last bone of their, in the case of the horse, of that middle finger. And so that is, just like being a ballet dancer with ballet shoes strapped on. And that is kind of taking that running adaptation to the extreme. And that's why animals like horses are so good at that style of locomotion. Don't worry, this is a cast replica of the humerus, or the upper arm bone of Quetzalcoatlus, the giant Texas pterosaur. And this is an example of a bone that has been modified for flight. It's got this huge process on here that allows muscles to attach to power the arms, because pterosaurs and birds, their way of locomoting is primarily by flying. And flying requires the use of arm muscles. Let's take a look at the skeleton we have mounted here. Make sure that we can see all the bones. We've got the humerus, that's the top of the arm, two of the forearm bones, the radius and the ulna. We've got some bones then that make up the wrist and the hand, all the way down to the very final tip, much of the finger bones. To give you an idea of size, I've brought a cast replica of one of the finger bones. And just like in our fingers, we've got 1, 2, 3 bones that make up that digit, and in this case, a nice hook on there. So what we're looking at when we look at the pterosaur is we got 3 small fingers and 1 really elongated finger. And those are numbers 1, 2, 3. So on our hand, it would be thumb, first finger, middle finger, and then the really elongated set of bones are the bones that make up that final 4th finger, that ring finger. So pterosaurs are actually flying using the power of their arms, reaching all the way out the length of their ring finger, or their 4th finger, if we compare it to humans. Now, birds do things a little bit differently. Birds have some modifications to their arms to allow them to fly, but what we see here is that we've got what we have are the fingers 1, 2, and 3, but they're fused and put into a shape that's really distinctive. We see this in birds. So this is something that they've inherited from their other dinosaur ancestors that typically would have 1, 2, 3 fingers. And what we see a fusion and modification of those 3 into what we consider today the wing of birds. You're looking at some artwork by Dr. Mark Whitten, paleontologist and artist, expert on pterosaurs. This is his depiction of Quetzalcoatlus on the hunt. You'll notice this giant pterosaur of Texas is hunting on the ground. So despite thinking about pterosaurs as spending most of their time in the air, they did spend a great deal of time on the ground, so they had to use their hind legs to move about. In fact, they actually folded up their wings and walked on all 4 limbs as they searched for food, looked for mates, set up their nests, and started to raise their young. Birds, like pterosaurs, also spend a good deal of time on their legs. When we look at a bird skeleton, especially the skeleton of a chicken, we can see that the hind leg is a huge component to that whole body skeleton. And we've got well-adapted bones for walking, spread out toes with claws, making that kind of classic three-toed track that we see in their extinct dinosaur relatives. Looks like this plesiosaur is flying through the air, doesn't it? Plesiosaurs are extinct reptiles that swam in the ocean that covered much of Texas 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. And when we look at the arms and the legs of this animal, they have some adaptations that give us clues that this animal was sort of flying through the water. It's some of the same features that we see in flying vertebrates, but a little bit different. We see long finger bones. So one clue that I use when I'm trying to identify if something is aquatic or marine, so it's living its life in the ocean or other body of water, is that we often see that the basic plan of 5 fingers and toes might be changed so that instead of having 5 fingers with 2 or 3 bones in each, we see multiple bones. We also notice that the arms and legs, the major bones, so the humerus and the femur, they're flattened. And so this shape looks a lot like an oar or a paddle. Do you see that? That's how we know we're dealing with a swimmer and not a flyer. Some other structures in the skeleton that are very similar to some of the flyers, like birds, is that those bones that make up what we call the pectoral girdles, so that's the bones that make up the chest where the arms attach to the rib cage. Look how flat they are. Those flat bones look a lot like a sled or the protective underparts of a vehicle. Those are wide, flat bones adapted for muscle attachment. And so with plesiosaurs, looking at the shape and structure of both the forelimbs, the front flippers and the back flippers, we can tell that they were using both, and especially using very powerful rowing-like or flying-like movements with their forelimbs to swim through the water. Now they're predators, so they're swimming not just to get from one place to another, but actually accelerate through the water to capture their prey, which could be everything from an ammonite to a small fish. Let's look at another marine reptile. Take a look at this skeleton. This is our Onion Creek Mosasaur. And you might notice, and we've learned, we can see the magic 5 fingers. We see some multiple bones, making those fingers and toe bones look really, really long. Imagine them covered with skin. So yeah, we've got flipper-like structures. But these skeletons are a little bit different from those of the plesiosaurs. You might notice that the tail is extremely long. That's the whole extension of the backbone, that vertebral column. And it's got that beautiful S-shaped curve to it. The tail itself toward the end is wider, so that's going to tell me that's something it can use to push against the water. So what's really cool about mosasaurs is that they're extinct relatives of snakes and lizards. And when we think about snakes, we think about animals that are able to move very, very quickly with this S-shaped motion, using just their backbone and using their tail, the muscles that are going to power that whole skeleton. Well, we see that evidence in the mosasaur skeleton. It's going to use its powerful tail to push through those Cretaceous ocean waters. And the flippers, they're much shorter and broader than what we saw in the plesiosaur. They're more for kind of changing position within the water, not so much for powering itself through that ocean realm that they were the top predators within. They too basically ate whatever they could capture. And so we kind of look at them as a classic ambush predator. So quick explosion of energy to reach out, grab ammonites, fish, smaller mosasaurs, you name it. That's the life of a top predator. When we want to learn something about how an ancient animal captures and chews its food, we look at skulls and teeth. When we want to understand something about how they sense the world, the general size of their eyes or the importance of their ears, we look at skulls. So they're very important parts of the skeleton. I have in front of me a set of skulls from some mammals that are alive today. We've got our bobcat, a coyote, a Virginia opossum, a raccoon, a cottontail rabbit, a porcupine, and a cast replica of a human being. And of course, at home, you've got your own skull, so you can kind of check out some of the things that you see here on this skull and compare it to what you see here with these other mammals. So look at the variety of shapes and sizes. So these are common animals here in Texas. And what's fabulous about them is that we can make some general observations to help us figure out what was really important for these animals in terms of adaptations to their particular lifestyle, just by looking at their skulls. The bobcat, for example, notice the really large eye sockets that are forward pointing. The eyes are super important for cats. They are visual hunters. Look at the really long snout of the coyote. Here's the opening for the nose. We know that coyotes and other members of the canid family have a really strong sense of smell, and so they're able to detect their prey and other messages that other animals have left by using this sense of smell. When we consider the sense of hearing, let's look at coyote versus Virginia opossum. And what I'm focusing on are, in the coyote, these strange kind of balloon-shaped bones here in the back of the skull. We can see them here, but we really don't see a balloon shape on the bones of the back of the skull in the opossum. These bones are part of the ear. And so when we see these balloon-like bones, we know these animals have a really strong, increased sense of hearing. So if you were to make a comparison, coyote obviously uses that sense very well. We think about what other members of the dog family do and how they have barks and howls and yips and how they communicate. You know, that sense of hearing is really important, especially across the miles when they have a large territory. With opossums, that sense of hearing probably is not so important. We don't see a lot of evidence for that. And probably they're depending mostly on that sense of smell. What you see in this photo is the palate or the roof of mouth view of the skull of a gray wolf. And the teeth are color-coded for the type of teeth that we identify as incisors, nipping teeth, the pointed, piercing canine teeth, a set of premolars, which can have a variety of shapes depending on what their function is, so everything from holding to shearing, and then a set of molars, which tend to be flatter and kind of lumpier, really good for crushing. These are the basic types of teeth that we see in mammals. And when we look at mammal skulls as a whole, we can see the great variety in the shape, size, and position of teeth, and that tells us a lot about diet. Bobcat, all slicing teeth and grabbing teeth. So this predator, preying on things like cottontail rabbits and other small mammals, it's basically grab and slice and swallow. They are what we would call a hypercarnivore. The coyote can eat a whole bunch of different types of food. So primarily a carnivore, also processing things like vegetables and fruit. If you've got a persimmon tree at your home, you know, that is a source of food for a lot of coyotes and foxes as well. If we look at a true omnivore, like what we see in this raccoon, you can see a lot of the teeth are rounded with these cusps, these low cusps that help kind of crush and pulverize their food. That's similar to what we see in humans, right? We look at our teeth. Our teeth are adapted for basically tearing at the front and then crushing and pulverizing our food in the back. And then we get the specialists with incisors in the front that are really good at nipping and gnawing. So I've got the porcupine and the rabbit here to give you an example of how that works. And what's great about porcupines, not only is the skull really large, but like other rodents, they have these beautiful layers of orange enamel, and that actually strengthens the tooth. And as they gnaw, they self-sharpen these teeth, which are ever growing. And so that's why if you've got a pet hamster or a mouse or a rat at home, you've got to have something there for them to chew on. And then when we open them up and look at a typical herbivore, once they get past those teeth in the front, all the teeth in the back, they're all the similar size and shape, right? And so that's an example of a typical pattern that we see in herbivores or our plant-eating mammals. Besides looking at the teeth, you can look at the position of the jaw joint in relationship to where it is in the line of where the teeth come together. And that can give us a clue to determine if we are looking at something that's a herbivore, an omnivore, or a carnivore. So I've got 3 examples here to show you this. I've got a horse, which we know is a herbivore, a grass eater. We've got a gray wolf, carnivore, and of course we've got our cast replica of a human. So let's start with the horse. So we've got the jaw joint right here and the tooth row right here, so where the teeth come together. And if I just use this ruler to show the line where the teeth come together right here, you'll notice that there's a great distance between my ruler and where my finger is pointing to the jaw joint. So the jaw joint is really high compared to the level of where all the chewing action is taking place. If we want to look at a carnivore, here's the jaw joint. I'll point that out here with my finger. There's the tooth row. And you'll notice that the jaw joint and the tooth row are almost exactly in line. And that's a characteristic that we see in a lot of carnivores. Well, what do we have left? We have the omnivores. Let's check out the human. Here's the jaw joint. I'll point it out with my finger. Here is the tooth row where the teeth come together. And so not as tall as a horse skull, but it is above the tooth row here on this human. So I would, consider this evidence that humans in general are omnivores. Would you agree? Some unique adaptations that we see in animals that live in water can be seen in their skulls. If you're a reptile, like a mosasaur, or a mammal, like this bottlenose dolphin, you still have to breathe air, even though you're living your lives completely underwater. They don't have gills like fish, so they've got to come up to the surface to get their air. One of the adaptations that we see in their skulls is that the openings to the nose have moved from what we kind of consider the tip of the snout, kind of front of the face, a little bit further back on the skull. And this is really apparent when we look at whales and dolphins. These are the openings for the blowhole. This is the nasal opening. So instead of the nose openings being here at the tip of the snout, they're all the way up here on the forehead of this dolphin. Another set of adaptations is all about capturing food. So you'll notice the similarity in the basic shape and number of teeth. So instead of having a certain number of teeth with different shapes and sizes, we get a whole series of pointed conical teeth. These are perfectly adapted for grabbing slippery prey while underwater. I want to thank you for taking a dive with me today into secrets in skeletons.